The warm Pacific air shimmered above blood-stained waters. June 1944 stretched endlessly across the Philippine Sea. A young Japanese pilot floated among the wreckage of his dreams. Lieutenant Junior Grade Saburo Kitamura had watched his Zero disintegrate around him. Metal screamed. Fire roared. The ocean rushed up to meet his broken body. Now American hands pulled him from the waves. His mind raced with everything he'd been taught. Torture would come first. Then starvation. Finally, death. But something else waited instead. Hours later, he stumbled through steel corridors. His torn uniform hung in tatters. Blood crusted his face. Fear made his hands shake uncontrollably. The mess hall doors swung open. What he saw inside made no sense at all. A tray appeared in his trembling fingers. Weight pressed down on his palms. Food he'd never imagined seeing at sea covered every inch. Fried chicken gleamed with grease. Butter pooled golden on mashed potatoes. Green beans glistened. White bread steamed soft and warm. Apple pie filled the air with cinnamon. Milk so cold it fogged the glass. Then came the question that shattered his world. A sailor looked at him impatiently. Chocolate or vanilla? Kitamura's mind went blank. The words bounced inside his skull like ricocheting bullets. Ice cream. On a warship. In the middle of battle. His nation's greatest carriers couldn't guarantee rice for their crews. Yet here aboard America's most battle-tested vessel, prisoners chose between flavors. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear of execution, from something far more terrifying. Everything Tokyo had told him might be lies. This moment would haunt him forever. The sweet taste of butter, the cold shock of milk, the impossible choice between chocolate and vanilla. They weren't just food. They were proof of abundance beyond his comprehension, proof of a world that existed beyond hunger and sacrifice. Across the Pacific, thousands of prisoners reached the same devastating conclusion. The enemy wasn't weak. The enemy wasn't barbaric. The enemy had mastered something greater than propaganda or fighting spirit. Industry, supply chains, abundance. Sometimes the most crushing weapon wasn't a bomb or bullet. Sometimes it was a spoonful of ice cream. Summer 1944 brought brutality to the Pacific War. The Imperial Japanese Navy crumbled under American firepower. Industry ground their fleet into scrap metal. The Battle of the Philippine Sea became history's Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft roared into combat. Swarms of American Hellcats tore them apart. Anti-aircraft fire created walls of death. Pilots trained for years died in minutes. Survivors floated in the waves, broken, waiting for death. Men like Saburo Kitamura had been prepared for what came next. Propaganda painted vivid pictures since childhood. Americans were devils in human form. Creatures who slaughtered prisoners without mercy. The Japanese state created grotesque images of the enemy. Barbarians who burned captives alive, starved them to death, even ate human flesh. Surrender was worse than death, they were taught. Better to sink with your ship. Better to crash into the enemy and die with honor. Yet beneath banners of divine destiny, reality was crumbling. Japan's supply lines lay in ruins. Food no longer flowed to the front lines. Rice stretched thin with barley and millet. Pickled vegetables became staples, often the only side dish sailors saw for weeks. Fresh meat turned into a distant memory. Vitamin deficiency diseases swept through entire crews. Beriberi, night blindness, scurvy. Caloric intake dropped to 1,400 calories daily. When rations were available at all, men entered combat half-starved, running on spirit instead of strength. Across the ocean, Americans lived in a different reality entirely. The United States Navy had become a floating empire of plenty. Carriers and battleships functioned as cities at sea, fed by supply chains spanning half the globe. Japanese sailors nibbled dried fish. American sailors feasted on roast beef, fresh bread, vegetables from refrigerated storage. They consumed over 4,000 calories daily, enough to sustain them, enough to keep morale high during endless months at sea. This contrast wasn't abstract. It was visible, immediate, undeniable. A Japanese pilot climbing from his wrecked Zero might step aboard an American carrier. The smell of fresh coffee hit him first. The sight of white bread stunned him. The sound of ice rattling in metal cups broke his spirit. Everything clashed with what he'd been told. Everything shattered the illusion Tokyo had constructed. The Yamato spirit formed the foundation of Japan's war effort. Spiritual strength could overcome material weakness, they believed. Purity of devotion to the emperor could compensate for hunger, rust, dwindling resources. But captured pilots looking into American mess halls saw the myth dissolve. When they watched ordinary sailors eating better than Japanese admirals, faith crumbled. It wasn't just food. It was the machinery behind it, the technology, the sheer efficiency of abundance. Water evaporators produced endless gallons of fresh water from seawater. Refrigerators hummed day and night in tropical heat. Ice cream machines ran continuously, even during combat operations. To the Japanese, these were impossibilities. To the Americans, they were routine. Prisoners pulled from the ocean found themselves at the edge of revelation. Their nation had promised glory, had promised divine winds and spiritual triumph. Instead, they saw truth. America's power came from abundance, not myth. From logistics, not spirit alone. The foundation of Japanese ideology began to crack. Not under the roar of bombs, not under the crash of steel. Under the simple, staggering reality of a hot meal and a glass of milk. Japanese prisoners expected cruelty when they stepped aboard American carriers. They braced for beatings, for starvation, for humiliation at the hands of men propaganda called demons. Instead, bandages appeared. Morphine numbed their pain. Hot meals filled their empty stomachs. The shock wasn't immediate rage or disbelief. It was silence. Heavy silence loaded with confusion. Lieutenant Junior Grade Saburo Kitamura remembered the sting of antiseptic on his wounds. A corpsman injected morphine into his arm. Another pressed fresh water into his shaking hand. Real water. Not the brackish liquid his own ship had rationed for weeks. Hours later, he was led into the mess hall. His mind had prepared for execution. His body had prepared for torment. What he found instead was abundance beyond imagination. Trays glistened with food still steaming from the grill. Meat swimming in rich gravies. Vegetables drowning in butter. White bread warm and soft in the center. Crisp at the edges. Apple pie fragrant with cinnamon and sugar. Milk chilled until frost formed on the glass. And then the question that broke him. Casual. Almost impatient. Chocolate or vanilla? That question shattered something deep inside him. He couldn't answer. He couldn't speak. For the first time since leaving Japan, his spirit faltered. Not from enemy fire, from the crushing weight of unexpected kindness. Other prisoners told identical stories. Commander Mitsuo Fujita, mastermind of Pearl Harbor itself, expected death when sailors dragged him aboard the USS Missouri. Instead, someone offered him coffee with sugar and cream. Fujita hadn't tasted such luxury since 1942. He braced for cruelty. received warmth in a ceramic cup instead. The sailor apologized that no donuts remained. Fujita wrote later that this single detail devastated him more than bombs. The casual complaint about missing donuts revealed the scale of American plenty. For men raised in a culture where rice balls were luxuries, the variety on American ships was staggering. Daily meals rotated like menus in grand hotels. Roast beef one day, fried chicken the next, ham glazed with pineapple on Sundays, eggs for breakfast every morning, bread baked fresh on board, ice cream served at midnight watches. Japanese sailors counted calories to survive. American crews worried only about flavor preferences. The shock deepened when Japanese prisoners explored ships beyond mess halls. Petty Officer Kazuo Sakamaki, captured early in the war, was stunned by his time aboard an American submarine. Hot showers flowed without rationing. Mattresses had clean sheets changed weekly. Libraries contained books and magazines. Coffee pots never ran dry. He admitted later that American submariners lived better beneath the ocean than Japanese officers lived on land. Everywhere, abundance shouted its presence. Laundry rooms with machines that washed and dried clothes twice weekly, ice machines pouring cubes into pitchers of water, soda fountains serving milkshakes between watches, radios playing music day and night, movie projectors showing Hollywood films on open decks. American enlisted men lived in comfort that rivaled Japanese nobility's homes. For prisoners, these weren't luxuries. They were revelations. Every plate of food contradicted their lifelong teachings. Every soft bed challenged everything they'd believed. Every glass of cold milk shattered propaganda they'd absorbed since childhood. They'd been promised America was decadent and weak, that too much comfort made men fragile. But here, on these steel fortresses at sea, comfort had created strength. Logistics had built endurance, not weakness. So the prisoners began questioning everything. If America could feed its enemies with more generosity than Japan fed its heroes, what did that mean? What did it mean about the war? About the emperor? About the future they'd been promised? For men who'd risked their lives for honor, the deepest wound wasn't physical. It was the wound of realization. The war they were fighting was already lost. They'd learned it not from defeat in battle, from a simple meal served with ice cream. For Japanese prisoners, the first shock came with food. The second came with the machinery that produced such abundance. It wasn't a single meal that broke their faith in Yamato spirit. It was the systems that created those meals, again and again, without pause, even in the middle of war. On the USS Enterprise, evaporators churned constantly, turning seawater into over 140,000 gallons of fresh water daily. Showers flowed without rationing. Laundry machines spun day and night, pressing uniforms clean around the clock. To men who'd gone weeks without bathing, this was unthinkable. Who'd scrubbed clothes with salt water? This seemed like sorcery. Fresh water in such quantities defied imagination. The galleys were equally astonishing. Bakeries kneaded and baked 15,000 loaves of bread daily. Butcher shops processed whole carcasses in refrigerated spaces larger than Japanese submarines. Ice machines produced tons of ice. Not only for food storage, for drinks, for comfort. Steam kettles cooked hundreds of gallons of soup at once. Potato peelers stripped sacks of vegetables in minutes, where Japanese sailors relied on their own hands and endless labor. American ships replaced sweat with machines everywhere possible. And then there was ice cream. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was an impossibility, a frivolous luxury no warship could ever afford. Yet by 1943, Americans had built floating ice cream factories, concrete barges converted into dessert ships, producing 5,000 gallons of frozen sweetness in single shifts. The USS Lexington's plant alone turned out 500 gallons daily. When torpedoes tore into her hull, sailors fleeing the listing deck carried buckets of ice cream with them, unwilling to abandon even that luxury. To Japanese prisoners, this was madness. It was also devastating proof. If a nation could make ice cream at sea in the middle of the Pacific while fighting a world war, what couldn't that nation achieve? The answer was clear: nothing. Prisoners saw more. Supply ships slid into formation beside carriers, transferring fuel, ammunition, and food in hours. In those hours, Americans received more fresh fruit than Japanese crews had seen in months. More meat, more vegetables, tomatoes, lettuce, oranges, apples, fruits that tasted of home, fruits that tasted like victory. Mail arrived as well. Thousands of letters shrunk onto film and delivered across the ocean, bringing news from home each week. Packages carried chocolate, cigarettes, photographs. For Japanese men who might receive one letter in a year, if they were lucky, this constant connection to family was shattering. More shattering than shell bursts. It reminded them that America fought not only with weapons, but with the unbroken will of a people sustained by abundance. The shock continued when prisoners were taken through medical bays. They saw surgical theaters equal to land hospitals. They saw blood banks, antibiotics, penicillin applied to wounds that would have killed men back home, now healing in days instead of weeks. A Japanese pilot with an infected leg begged his captors not to waste medicine on him. A pharmacist's mate opened lockers filled with sulfur and morphine. "We have plenty," he said simply. The pilot began to cry. Even in battle, abundance flowed without pause. Kamikaze strikes tore holes in carrier decks, but repair crews swarmed like clockwork, welding, hammering, sealing metal. Flight operations continued within hours. Foam smothered flames. Pumps drove out water faster than it could enter. Japanese prisoners watched ships that should have sunk by their own reckoning fight on. The message was crystal clear. Spirit might inspire men to fight, but logistics kept them alive to win. The more they saw, the more they understood. American sailors weren't weakened by plenty. They were sustained by it. Their strength came from machines that never rested, from kitchens that never closed, from supplies that never ran dry. It wasn't a single moment that changed everything, not a single plate of food, but the relentless, unstoppable rhythm of abundance. As days passed, Japanese prisoners couldn't escape the truth. Their empire, built on sacrifice and starvation, was already defeated. Not by one battle, not by one fleet, by the machinery of plenty that never stopped moving, never stopped feeding, never stopped winning. Christmas 1944 arrived while war still raged across the Pacific. Yet aboard American carriers, a different kind of battle unfolded. For Japanese prisoners, this was when disbelief transformed into certainty. Seaman Hiroshi Nakamura, confined aboard the USS Saratoga, watched the mess hall transform into a holiday feast. Paper decorations hung from steel walls. Lights glowed across metal beams. Sailors laughed and sang, exchanging gifts sent from home. The menu read like fantasy: roast turkey with stuffing, ham glazed with pineapple, mashed potatoes and sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, 3 kinds of vegetables, fresh rolls still warm, pies of every flavor imaginable, ice cream by the tubful. Each sailor received presents: cigarettes, books, razors, candy from home. It wasn't only abundance, it was joy, pure, unrestrained joy. For Nakamura, The realization cut deeper than hunger ever had. He wrote in his hidden diary, "While we attacked them, they celebrated. They were happy. We were starving and dying for the emperor, while our enemies feasted at sea. That was the moment I knew Japan had already lost." The contrast couldn't have been more brutal. In Japan, families struggled to survive on rice stretched with weeds and bark. Cities lay in ruins from bombing raids. Soldiers fought with empty stomachs and hollow eyes. Yet here, thousands of miles from home, their enemies celebrated Christmas as if war were a distant storm. For prisoners, the cognitive dissonance was unbearable. Some wept openly, unable to reconcile what they saw with what they'd been taught. They'd been told America was decadent, soft, weak. Instead, they witnessed strength born from abundance. Sailors who ate ice cream after fighting fires, crews who repaired their ships while singing carols, men who welcomed the season not with despair, but with plenty. Lieutenant Commander Tishi Mieta, a Zero pilot shot down near Iwo Jima, remembered his time on the USS Bunker Hill. He watched enlisted men receive letters and packages from home, filled with photographs, chocolates, cigarettes. One sailor tossed aside a candy bar that had melted slightly. Mieta stared at it, stunned. That single bar of chocolate represented more sugar than Japanese pilots saw in months. To see it discarded casually wasn't just shocking. It was crushing. Then came the music. Bands played carols through the passageways. Choirs of sailors sang Silent Night under Pacific stars. To Japanese prisoners, this sound wasn't weakness, it was defiance. A declaration that America could wage total war and still hold on to celebration, still hold on to humanity. The climax wasn't a battle in the skies, not a clash of fleets. It was this: the sight of an enemy who chose to celebrate life in the midst of war. It wasn't bombs that destroyed the Yamato spirit. It was laughter over a holiday meal, the smell of turkey drifting through steel corridors, the sight of prisoners being handed gifts, of enemies being treated with dignity, of abundance shared even in the shadow of death. For many, this moment sealed the truth. Japan couldn't win. Spirit alone couldn't triumph over a nation that turned the ocean into a factory of food, water, and joy. A nation that celebrated while fighting. A nation that offered ice cream to its enemies. Christmas on the carriers was more than a holiday. It was a revelation. It struck harder than any bomb, deeper than any torpedo. For prisoners who witnessed it, the war was already over. When the war finally ended, Japanese prisoners carried something home that no bomb could deliver. Memories of abundance. They returned not simply as defeated soldiers, but as witnesses to a different kind of power. Their stories spread across a shattered nation like sparks in dry grass. Lieutenant Junior Grade Saburo Kitamura never forgot the first tray placed in his hands, or the question that broke his world apart. When he returned to Japan, he told his family about the fried chicken, the mashed potatoes, the cold milk. He described ice cream that came in flavors. His relatives stared at him in disbelief. In villages still scraping meals from weeds and bark, his testimony sounded like fantasy. But it was true. He wasn't alone. Thousands of repatriated prisoners carried similar memories. They spoke of clean uniforms issued twice weekly, of showers with endless hot water, of libraries and movie theaters aboard carriers, of sailors complaining about meals Japanese admirals would have considered feasts. They spoke of hospitals at sea, of wounds treated with antibiotics that healed in days, of surgeries conducted with precision and care, even for enemies. These stories spread through ruined cities and hungry homes. undermining myths Tokyo had built for decades. Commander Mitsuo Fujita, mastermind of Pearl Harbor, became the most famous of them all. His transformation began with a cup of coffee aboard the USS Missouri. Years later, he renounced militarism completely, converted to Christianity, dedicated his life to reconciliation. He admitted openly that what broke his faith in Japan's destiny wasn't American guns. It was the casual generosity of American sailors. A sailor who apologized for running out of donuts had changed his life forever. For many Japanese, these testimonies carried more power than occupation propaganda. Leaflets could be dismissed. Radio broadcasts could be ignored. But voices of their own soldiers couldn't be silenced. Men who had fought, bled, and been captured. They carried proof in their eyes, in their memories, in their very survival. Proof that America's strength came not from cruelty, but from kindness. Not from scarcity, but from overwhelming supply. In the ruins of Tokyo and Osaka, as people struggled to rebuild their lives, prisoners' words offered both humiliation and hope. Humiliation because they confirmed Japan's weakness. Hope because they revealed the enemy who defeated them wasn't the monster of propaganda, but a nation capable of mercy. A nation that treated even its enemies with humanity. The transformation was subtle but profound. The Yamato spirit, once preached as unbreakable, had collapsed under reality's weight. The idea that sheer willpower could triumph over material strength had been exposed as illusion. What mattered was logistics. What mattered was industry. What mattered was the ability to feed, clothe, and care for men even in the midst of war. For returning prisoners, this realization was both painful and liberating. They had seen the future. It didn't look like the militarist empire they'd served. It looked like a society where abundance sustained strength, where kindness existed even in battle, where enemies could become teachers. They became, unwillingly, ambassadors of that truth. Their words laid the foundation for Japan's acceptance of defeat, and for its transformation in the years that followed. Because once you'd seen sailors eat ice cream after fighting fires, you could never again believe in myths of starvation and sacrifice. Once you'd seen Christmas feasts on ships at war, you understood abundance wasn't weakness. Once you'd been healed with medicine that could have been denied but was freely given, you knew humanity could survive even the worst conflicts. The aftermath wasn't only surrender, it was revelation, carried back to Japan in the voices of men who had tasted chocolate ice cream in the middle of war. The legacy of those first American meals reached far beyond carrier decks, far beyond the lives of prisoners who tasted them. It reached into the heart of Japan itself, reshaping how a nation understood both defeat and rebirth. When the war ended, the Japanese people faced ruins. Cities burned, families starved, faith in their leaders shattered. Yet into that silence came voices speaking of something unthinkable. Voices of their own soldiers, men who had stared into defeat's abyss and returned with tales not of torture, but of kindness. They spoke of ice cream aboard warships, of turkeys served at Christmas, of hot showers and medical care, of enemies who shared abundance instead of cruelty. For Japan, these stories became seeds of transformation. The myth of Yamato spirit had crumbled completely. No longer could people believe that sacrifice and hunger alone could triumph. They had seen the truth. It was logistics, industry, and the will to sustain life that defined real strength. Even enemy life. The revelation was devastating. But it was also liberating. It allowed Japan to move beyond militarism's illusions, to accept a future built not on conquest, but on prosperity. The men who carried these memories became unexpected ambassadors. They didn't speak as propagandists. They spoke as witnesses. They told of sailors who complained about food that would have been feasts in Japan. They told of carriers that produced water from seawater, bread from machines, ice cream in the tropics. They told of surgeries conducted with care, even for enemies who had tried to kill. These testimonies carried weight no American speech could match. They were truths carved into memory, undeniable, unshakable. For Commander Mitsuo Fujita, the change was deeply personal. The man who led the attack on Pearl Harbor became a preacher of reconciliation. His life redirected by the simple kindness of a cup of coffee and a sailor's apology about donuts. His story embodied the greater transformation, the shift from vengeance to forgiveness, from destruction to renewal. The broader legacy was cultural. Post-war Japan rebuilt itself with a new understanding of power. Abundance was no longer seen as weakness. Comfort was no longer decadence. Instead, the lesson of American carriers became clear. Strength is sustained not by deprivation, but by the ability to provide, by the ability to create plenty even in war, by the ability to extend humanity even to enemies. The story of ice cream aboard American warships became more than a curious anecdote. It became a symbol of how democracy's greatest weapon wasn't just firepower, but abundance. A symbol of how kindness could dismantle ideology more thoroughly than any bomb. A symbol of how the smallest gesture could undo years of propaganda. A spoonful of vanilla, a slice of pie, a cup of coffee. They could open the door to change. By the time Japan emerged as a democratic ally, echoes of those meals still lingered. Former prisoners carried them into their families, their communities, their culture. They carried the memory that defeat had revealed something greater than spirit. That true power was measured not in slogans, but in the ability to sustain, to care, to share. The war had shown the horrors of destruction, but in its quietest moments, it also revealed another truth. That abundance can conquer despair. That kindness can shatter myths. That sometimes the most enduring victory is won not with weapons, but with the humanity to feed even your enemies. The legacy of the first American meal endured. It wasn't just the taste of ice cream in the middle of war. It was the taste of a new world, a world where Japan would rise again, not as an empire of sacrifice, but as a nation remade by the lessons of abundance.